Let's start. Hello and welcome to the first public presentation and discussion of the latest flagship report in English by the German Advisory Council on Global Change, or in short, WBGU, entitled Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, from Separation to Integration. My name is Rebecca Freitag. I'm a former UN Youth Delegate on Sustainable Development, and I'm your presenter today. For at least my generation, but also for those generations to come, there are essential questions. Questions such as, how can we protect our climate? How can we protect our ecosystems? And how can we make food systems more sustainable? And if possible, all at once? Well, the answers actually lie in this flagship report, and it's fundamental change in the way we manage land, which we will present and discuss today. Also, a very warm welcome on behalf of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. It's a scientific advisory council with a very special position. It's politically independent and provides impulses and ideas. It puts the important issues of tomorrow on today's political agenda, both nationally and internationally. This new flagship report is agenda setting as well. The topic is, we can call it a sleeping giant. It has great explosive power, but also great solving power. Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, from Separation to Integration. Anthropocene stands for the new geological age in which humans have become the determining factor for the planet's ecosystem. This report, which has 388 pages, has been a work of 2 years and includes a lot of international experts. Today's first English presentation marks the beginning of a long journey for the report. With the global mandate of the Advisory Council and with you as our guests today from all over the world, the report will be taken into the world to have an international impact. We will start today with a short wrap-up of the report by the two co-chairs, Karen Pittel and Sabine Schlacke. And then we have the honor to listen to two international experts who will comment on this report. We therefore invited Tina Birmpili. She is the Deputy Executive Secretary for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And we also have Florent Kaiser. He is an aquapreneur and the Executive Director of the Global Forest Generation. We then switch into a discussion where I would really like to get you involved as well. So please write your questions into the Q&A sections. You can also like them, so they are actually more likely to be passed on to the panelists. Or you can also raise your hand and then you can give your question verbally. For this last discussion round, we also invite one of the authors of the report, which is Markus Fischer. Well, so that's so much about me. There's a little technical note. Your cameras and your microphones will actually be remained off for the entire event. And now is the time where we want to get to know more about you. Which community do you belong to? We therefore have prepared a little survey that will appear in a few seconds. And it would be great if you could just take some seconds and tell us in which sector you work actually. May take a while, but yeah, we would really like to know whether you work in the business of science or politics, NGOs, is it media, education, international cooperation, businesses, or anything else we haven't listed. You have 2 more seconds and then I would like to close the survey to see the results. Let's see let's see where our audience, which is actually from all over the world today, to which communities they belong to. So the majority comes from the science community, actually. We have 44%, it's almost half of our listeners today. 14% belong to the political community, 16% NGOs, and then, yes, a little bit of business, education, and others. Great. Welcome again. And now we jump right into the presentation. So no matter whether you have read the report or not, here's a chance to refresh your knowledge. And I would like to hand over the microphone to Karen Pittel and Sabine Schlacke.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and also a very warm welcome from our side, from me and Sabine. And we are going to take the next, hopefully 15 minutes, more realistically 18 minutes, to actually present an overview of the report to you. So as you have already, do you see my screen? Is that all right? Somebody give me a sign.
Yes.
Thank you. Always the same questions, kind of a ritual in Zoom by now. As you've already heard, our latest flagship report is labeled or is called Rethinking Land in the Anthropocene, from Separation to Integration. And in the report, we start from the observation that we are currently witnessing 3 major global crises. We then go on to suggest exemplary multiple benefit strategies that aim at addressing all these 3 crises synergistically. And we close with government strategies that aim to support the implementation of these strategies and lead us towards a more solidarity-based land stewardship. Now I'm going to present a little bit on the first 2 parts, and then Sabine is going to take over and present you with the 3rd part. Now, the trilemma of land use we refer to as the 3 major global crises: the climate crisis, the food system or food security crisis, and the biodiversity crisis. And all 3 of those are directly related to land use. And although, let me just go through the 3 crises one after the other. The first crisis, the climate crisis, of course, mainly caused by the use of fossil fuels, but the way we deal with land today is also the source of considerable emissions. In addition, if we want to limit climate change to well below 2 degrees or even to 1.5 degrees, we can hardly avoid actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere, yet some of those methods that are suggested for that are also very land intensive. The second crisis that we are witnessing is not that often discussed, but as urgent. That's the food security or food system crisis. Currently, or today, we are producing enough food, sufficient food, but this food is by no means accessible to everyone. So we still see that there are almost 2 billion people that have no access, or at least no regular access, to sufficiently safe and nutritious food. And at the same time, we have 2 billion people worldwide who are overweight. Furthermore, the way we produce food is massively detrimental to our environment. For example, as a result of pesticide use, of greenhouse gas emissions, and the destruction of the ecosystems. And yet, the pressure that we exert on land today and on the food system is still expected to increase in the future, as the world population is still growing and many of our dietary habits require a lot of land. Third crisis that we are observing is the biodiversity crisis, the massive decline in biodiversity. Worldwide, more and more natural ecosystems are being destroyed to make room for farmland, for pasture land, for industry, infrastructure, buildings. And when you add to that pollution, poaching, climate change, what you get is the result. As a result, is a mass extinction of species worldwide, and this loss of ecosystem, of species diversity also means a loss of nature's contributions and services, which are invaluable to humans. And to avert this biodiversity crisis, the destruction of our ecosystems must be halted, and their conservation and their restoration have to be promoted. Now, like I said, in order to contribute to overcoming these three global crises, we suggest 5 multiple benefit strategies, and these I'm just going to give you an overview of to basically outline shortly. The first strategy is ecosystem restoration, and it's motivated by the need to create new carbon sinks, since global CO2 emissions, at the moment at least, are falling way too slowly. However, both the natural and the technical potential of many of these methods to store and to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere are still very uncertain. Some of the methods are very land intensive as well, and they also involve the risk that the storage of the CO2 might actually not be permanent. We therefore primarily recommend that CO2 sinks should not be treated equally with emission reductions, but that explicit separate targets should be formulated for cutting emissions and for removing CO2. In any case, CO2 emissions must fall rapidly in order to minimize the need for a CO2 removal. And this kind of like reducing the need also makes it possible to focus on ecosystem restoration as a multiple benefit strategy. Ecosystem restoration aims to rehabilitate ecosystem services by returning degraded land to a more natural state. Examples include, for example, reforestation, the rewetting of peatlands, but also the restoration of grassland ecosystems. This ecosystem restoration, on the one hand, increases absorption of CO2, but on the other hand, also gives rise to an increase in biodiversity and also can support food security. For example, because ecosystem services, just for example, the pollination of agricultural land by insects are improved. So this is the first strategy. The second strategy is the expansion and upgrading of protected area systems. And basically the biodiversity crisis cannot be overcome without this multiple benefit strategy, without upgrading and expanding protected areas. Protected areas simultaneously not only benefit the biodiversity, but also the climate, since the conservation of ecosystem prevents CO2 emissions, but also protected areas absorb and store CO2 from the air. And also, finally, for our third crisis, protected areas also offer added value for food security, as these areas not only protect the genetic resources, but can also be compatible with, for example, a sustainable agriculture in cultural landscapes. At the moment, scientists and policymakers are calling for the expansion of protected area systems to cover at least 30% of the global land surface as a meaningful target, which is a target that we also support. However, the quantity of the protected areas is one thing, but the quality of the protected areas also has to be ensured. And for this, established and internationally agreed criteria already exist. One more point that we stress in the report is actually that the conservation of ecosystems should specifically also take care of areas that are inhabited by indigenous people and by local communities. And these ecosystems alone account for over a quarter of the land's or of the Earth's surface. As a third strategy, we propose agriculture. And in this, we focus primarily on the EU and on sub-Saharan Africa. In either area, soils are becoming more and more degraded, although for very different reasons. In the EU, it's primarily due to the excessive use of pesticides and fertilizers. In sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, is due to the insufficient fertilization. In addition, there's a global trend towards growing fewer and fewer plant varieties. So overall, we recommend diversifying farming systems and using land in a more multifunctional and varied way. And let me just give you two examples for that. One is agroforestry systems, which combine trees with farming and with livestock. And the other one is agrophotovoltaics, where solar panels, in a sense, are used to protect fields from too much solar radiation. However, the focus in both industrialized and in developing countries should be on creating ecologically intensive systems that contribute to food security, to biodiversity, and to climate change mitigation. Additionally, we also stress that agricultural policy of the future should be more closely linked with environmental and with climate policy. At the moment, these areas are in many cases still treated very distinctly. Our fourth strategies concerns dietary habits, and this concerns especially industrialized countries. We stress that the focus should be equally on human health, but also on the conservation of ecosystem services. At the moment, the high proportion of animal products in people's diets is having a negative effect on both dimensions, on health and on ecosystem services. A switch to more plant-based food, on the other hand, would require less area and can thus relieve the pressure on our land. This change of dietary habits can then directly linked to a change in people's values. In Europe, for example, we already observe a trend towards reduced meat consumption. In our report, we then also propose that the planetary health diet, as it was recently introduced by the Eat Lancet Commission, can contribute to pointing into the right direction, the way forward, with its high vegetable and low meat content. We therefore propose that this planetary health diet should be integrated into dietary guidelines, but also, for example, should be used as a basis of menus of public canteens. But at the same time, additionally to these more kind of soft measures, we also advocate that conditions must be created that ensure that food prices better and increasingly reflect environmental costs. And then finally, the fifth strategy that we recommend concerns the bioeconomy and their responsible design. So basically using biomass from material and energy. In this context, it's particularly important to bear in mind that biomass is not available in unlimited quantities, and that we have to give priority to food supply, to biodiversity conservation, and to natural carbon reservoirs. The bioeconomy should focus especially, because it's so limited, on applications that also store biomass and at the same time, of course, its carbon contents for long periods of times. And building with wood is just one really good example for that. And we therefore recommend that the German government, together with international partners, actually should proclaim a mission for sustainable construction. And this mission that should specifically promote sustainable building and make it more attractive. Of course, that only really fosters sustainable land use if it's done under the condition that the timber is also produced in a sustainable way. Now, we believe that these 5 multiple benefit strategies that I've just outlined are critical to achieving sustainable land stewardship on a global level. But whether and how these strategies are implemented depends crucially on the actors, but also on the framework of governance. So the WGBO therefore proposes 5 government strategies, which are going to be introduced now by my colleague Sabine.
Thank you, Karen. Let's move on to the last part of the presentation. You mentioned already whether the 5 multi-benefit strategies just proposed are implemented, and how they are implemented depends largely on the actors and at the same time on the governance framework. Land is a part of the global commons, as it is the basis of healthy and productive ecosystems, and thus the basis of human life worldwide. The WBGU proposes 5 strategies, and in our view, the following actors have to be supported, that are change agents, firstly, the proactive state, the European Union, the international cooperation, and new cooperation alliances. Next, please. Many change agents are experimenting with new land-based conservation and use practices which I like to give you 2 examples. Yesterday, I got to know the so-called Olga project. It aims to increase profits by improving the ecological functions of watercourses and floodplains, and at the same time, the cultivation of energy wood along rivers, which should lead to a regional distribution of the wood products. This Olga project is located in Germany, in Saxony. Other change agents I met in Brazil. Brazilian NGOs have managed to prevent the extinction of the golden tamarin monkey by reforesting the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil with the financial support of zoos and NGOs all over the world. And I have to add, not with the financial support of the Brazilian government. However, these change agents can only be truly effective if there is a corresponding framework that enables them. Individual actors, especially people and institutions, should, if they are pioneers, if they are change agents, be supported, for example, financially, and not hindered by proper, especially governmental framework. Next, please. States, and not only NGOs, should support these change agents. This is one of our most important recommendations. It's the states that have the power over the global commons of land and soil. It's their territorial power that they exercise. And this must, of course, be exercised in such a way that the land can indeed be used sustainably and multifunctionally. States can do this in different ways. On the one hand, they can create incentives, for example, offer support, for example, by granting financial subsidies or enabling certifications for products that originate from sustainable land use. But Based on our conviction and our analysis, we can also say that incentives and subsidies alone will not be sufficient. Regulations and bans are also needed. For example, prohibitions of unsustainable land use. And beside that, we also think that special emphasis should lie on integrated spatial and landscape planning. Next, please. Thirdly, within the framework of the European Green Deal, the European Union should promote a land transition vis-à-vis the member states and third countries. This, according to everything that is apparent, will not be possible in the context of the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy from 2021 to 2027. It would be necessary to transform the Common Agricultural Policy into a common ecosystem policy. In other words, common ecosystem policies. After that, state support will only be available if the agricultural measure is also ecological. This makes it all the more important for member states to use their remaining margins within the so-called CAP to make their agricultural subsidies greener. And fourthly, the WBGU proposes to intensify international cooperation in dealing with land use and to make it more inclusive. Good starting points are the three Rio conventions, namely the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. However, each of these conventions looks at land from more or less a sectoral viewpoint. They are not interlinked in the sense of governing the land use in a multifunctional sense. In this respect, these conventions need to be more closely interlinked, and the best way to do this is to hold a joint conference as soon as possible. So we do not propose a new convention, especially for the governing of land use. We think we should stick on the current conventions and interlink them a little bit more. So we propose a so-called Global Land Summit, and the starting signal for such an international conference should be set by 2022. And it is in the area of biodiversity that there are the greatest, in our view, the greatest regulatory gaps and need to catch up. The WBGU therefore proposes the negotiation of 2 new binding protocols on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, which would, among other things, enshrine in international law the multi-benefit strategies of conservation and enhancement of protected areas, as well as diversified farming systems. And now I come to the 5th governance strategy. The WBGU recommends the establishment of new cooperation alliances of like-minded states or subnational regions, in addition to strengthening international cooperation within the framework of existing treaties. These new forms of multilateral cooperation could take the following form. And now I like to present you 3 models we created in our discussions. First of all, the regional alliances, regional subnational communities think, for example, of border regions such as Germany and the Netherlands, could be formed to provide a framework for cross-border land use, for example, in the sense of regional innovation hubs for sustainable farming methods, or in the sense of a regional circular economy or value chain. And the second model, these are the supranational alliances in a kind of a supranational federation of states, similar to the EU, the European Union. Member states from different continents, not only in Europe, could come together to agree on common land use and production standards or trade agreements, allowing sustainable agricultural trade to take place beyond regions of the world. And thirdly, global conservation alliances. They could be set up by states or also in cooperation with private protagonists to preserve valuable ecosystems, such as the Amazon rainforest in third countries. To give just one example, and leasing such an area may be an appropriate tool to generate benefits for both sides. To sum up, a global land use transformation needs systemic interrelations, synergistic interactions from separation to integration, and a solidarity-based assumption of responsibility. Only if our approach to land stewardship changes fundamentally and profoundly will we succeed in achieving the international climate protection goals, will be able to halt or perhaps stop altogether the dramatic decline of biodiversity we are currently experiencing. And let me finish with the following appeal. Only if our approach to land stewardship fundamentally and profoundly change, we will succeed with all these international goals we have already. And now I will thank you for your attention, and I will at the end finish with this slide. You can download the long and short versions of the WBGU report from the website, or we will send you a free book free of charge. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sabina and Karen. Thanks for that juicy summary of that very long report. And now we set the stage for our experts. We start with Tina Birmpili. She has dedicated her career path to sustainable development at all levels of government, actually, be it as a former Minister of Environment, Energy and Climate Change in Greece, or as the former Executive Secretary of the Vienna Convention for the Ozone Layer and Montreal Protocol, and today as the Deputy Executive Secretary for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. A lot of expertise, wow. Now we are looking so much forward for your perspectives and insights, Tina. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Dear colleagues, dear scientists from the German Advisory Council, panelists, thank you for this opportunity to join you in launching the report on Rethinking Land in the Era of the Anthropocene. It is a welcome addition to multilateral efforts to address the issues of land and to our agenda at the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, which I have to say since the beginning that it's a much narrower agenda than what we were talking today. The report provides thoughts, insights, recommendations that we can discuss not only today, but also in the years to come. So a very big thanks to the work of the German Advisory Council. If climate and biodiversity are two sides of the same coin, as it was explained to us by the trilemma, then land is the nickel that holds the coin together. It is the global commons that connects carbon and species. In addressing the trilemma of land use, we must also be explicit about the role of land in providing energy, water, livelihoods, and human health, both mental and physical. Many of these ecosystem services have long been taken for granted and as such have been undervalued. A true cost accounting of nature's contribution to people will help governments and business prioritize sustainability. This has not been explicitly mentioned in the presentation, but I do believe that this is an important parameter. As the Rethinking Land report points out, we will need to mitigate these intertwined crises as a collective and at all scales, from producers to consumers and everyone in between. We are very conscious of the demand side drivers and how our consumer choices for land-based commodities search down the supply chain and influence how the land is used and managed. Our food systems today are linear. We produce, we consume, and we throw. We consume the food the systems produce, and the systems consume our planet. Diets and food systems are a significant part of the solution, but transformation will also require rapid decarbonization and a transition to a circular economy, where we not only reuse and recycle, but design for sustainability. As it is said in the report, we must move from separation to integration. The UNCCD advocates strongly for long-term land use planning to optimize scarce resource allocation, avoid conflict in some cases, and protect the health and productivity of the land. Strategic planning is a necessary tool for successful integrated landscape management. And as it is said in the report, and this is a sentence which I'm very much aligned with, a landscape approach is small enough to keep decision-making processes manageable, but large enough to accommodate different interests from land users. And I think these are the examples that should be scaled up. The Rethinking the Land report is also timely as it helps to increase attention to the global land restoration agenda and generate momentum and synergies within the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which has started this year, and also the Food System Summit, which will take place in September. Land restoration is ultimately about creating opportunities for people. Green stimuli can create decent jobs and support change agents who pioneer new practices to use and manage the land sustainably. Women, youth, indigenous people, future entrepreneurs. To reimagine, recreate, and restore the planet, we need to recognize and respect the rights, rewards, and responsibilities of all stakeholders. Secure and equitable land and resource rights is a necessary condition for a people and livelihoods approach to land restoration. Farmers and land managers need incentives to undertake better land stewardship and bring in innovation into the land use sector. We must support any agent of change. This is something that I can very much underline after reading the report. All restoration is place-based. Inclusive governance and innovative financing approach need to be strongest at the local level. Land degradation neutrality is a sustainable development goal target and is a key pathway to accelerating progress towards many sustainable development goals. It is a commitment under the UNCCD to restore degraded land and soil. Until now, over 125 countries have already made similar commitments. This is equivalent to almost half of the restoration pledges made under the Rio Conventions and the Bond Challenge combined, which totals 1 billion of hectares. Transforming degraded landscapes means ensuring that COVID-19 recovery packages back solutions that restore land make agriculture nature positive, and end the global linear culture of take, make, and waste. We must make the straight line of our thinking and of our systems a circle, move from our linear economy to a circular one. The future is not something that happens to us, but is something that we actively create. So let us reimagine, recreate, and restore with rights, rewards, and responsibilities. Thank you for the important work you have done, and thank you for making accessible this report to a wider range of stakeholders.
And thank you, Tina, for your comment. Before we turn to the next expert, I would like to invite you, dear audience, to also raise your questions to those who have already spoken or to the expert who is going to come. Please put your question into the Q&A section, and then we can take them into our discussion. Now we are looking forward to listen to Florent Kaiser. He is a conservationist turned entrepreneur, or you can also call it ecopreneur. He is the executive director for the Global Forest Generation. That's an NGO that scales up locally led ecosystem restorations with global partnerships. And he focuses very much on the grassroots level. This NGO contributes to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and he advises the World Economic Forum's Trillion Tree campaign. The floor is yours, Florent.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to all the hosts and fellow speakers, but also to the contributors, of course, of this excellent report. I would like to thank you for inviting me to this symposium. And again, congratulations to this particularly comprehensive report I found. What struck me at first was that's one of the reports that finally achieves to really recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of major strategies and activities and systems. Now, that being said, I think most of my comments will be based, following my work as an entrepreneur and following specifically our intent to scale up grassroots ecosystem restoration efforts globally with one of our first big programs spanning over 6 countries in the South American Andes. Without further ado, I think the first overarching comment that I would like to bring forward is that as an entrepreneur and as a young person in general, what I'm witnessing and many other young people are, and which is giving us a particularly energetic and positive outlook, is that while the last decades have been focused quite a lot on understanding the climate crisis and at the same time realizing that we face severe challenges, and to be honest, also paired with quite a bit of doom and gloom towards our future and what's coming next, and particularly for vulnerable communities and young people, this has been, growing up within this is takes quite a toll on your life, and you're thinking quite a bit how your future will look like. However, what we're witnessing today, and which I couldn't embrace more, again, as an overarching comment, is that we're starting to leave behind this doom and gloom sort of looking at the climate crisis, and the era of restoration and regeneration is coming in, and it's coming into the minds of people. It's coming in into the way young people are approaching their lives, and this gives this change of narrative towards regenerative practices, and to not only less degradation and destruction, but actually rebuilding and healing and creating opportunities within that for youth, for personal lives, for businesses, for investors, for governments, is a fundamentally important mindset shift that is fueling all the rest of the work that is going on at the moment. Now, the second point would be that ecosystem restoration, yes, is as outlined excellently in the report, is complex, is multifaceted, and has multiple benefits. However, ecosystem restoration at the scale and at the pace that is needed globally will only be possible, and this is very fundamental, if it is managed and implemented it in a way that is decentralized and led by grassroots communities at the local level, by local people that actually believe in it and benefit from it directly. So, for example, one of the things that I always criticize a little bit in this global conversation is we tend, particularly in the global north, to look at the climate change issue from quite a central carbon perspective, and we know the report highlights that in different ways, and it's much more complex and so on. However, I would like to give you a concrete example. For example, where we work in the Andes, it's the highest in some of the highest communities, over 6,000 meters, 5,000 to 6,000 meters height in altitude. The glaciers are retreating. Water security, land security, and so food security become a severe issues. To be honest, people couldn't care less about the carbon. Yes, it has consequences and implied some, but we need to find narratives that work for local people. We need to understand fundamentally their struggles and motivations. And with that, one of the ways that we embrace in our work fully is by really finding the local change makers and the local leaders that you mentioned in the report, or change agents, I think you call them, that are able to capture the motivations of communities, that are able to accompany the local communities on their quest to bring back forests, restore their lands, and to actually make a living that fits to their culture and to their values and interests. And, you know, as a summary, there is still a lot of separation between, let's say, the global level of thinking of all the strategy and the local applicability of these strategies. And this is something we need to reconcile very, very strongly. And so for the third comment, to make a difference, we need to massively invest into local grassroots leadership and capacities on the ground. And at the moment, there's so much coming up within the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the whole framework. You know, corporations, governments, investors, everybody's moving towards this restoration efforts. We need to make sure that we accompany those efforts with that understanding and focus on local capacities, because the level of commitment is growing. However, the scale that local capacities and actual viable projects on the ground is growing is very separate from one another. We need many more actors focusing to help local communities building up projects, lives from the bottom up that are fully in line with ecosystem restoration efforts. And I know I'm going probably soon over time, but I want to highlight two things more. One, finance and policies are fundamental, right? But so is leadership at every single level. And so at this point, we really need not only leaders at the government level and global levels, we need to recognize the leaders on the ground that are actually driving these kinds of efforts fundamentally. And we also need more entrepreneurs in that space. We all grew up that are involved in this field with a lot of, with a big science focus and understanding, and it is fundamentally important. At this point, with the time frame that was given to us for action, and with the pace and scale that we need to act upon, we need to embrace the spirit of ecopreneurship or entrepreneurship and really get down to implementation as a big priority. And finally, within that, the youth plays an extraordinary important role into this. Not only we know that, we know this the future generation and all of it. What I said at the beginning, this mind shift of going from degradation towards regeneration and restoration, this shift of mindset, and looking at the next decades with an open eye for opportunities for restoration and regeneration, the youth we need to accompany the youth in their quest into moving into these kinds of opportunities around ecosystem restoration. And it has to do with education, it has to do with accompanying young entrepreneurs, it has to do with, basically, one last point on that is I always hear, the Trillion Trees campaign, and as Rebecca mentioned, I'm part of the advisories committees, and there's a strong symbolic act on planting trees, and it's definitely a good thing to do. I'm not going against it. However, it helps to also think, can we look at the, after 10 years of a UN decade on ecosystem restoration, can we measure its success not only in how many trees were planted, right, but also how many young people were able to actively pursue a career, a livelihood, a profession into ecosystem restoration and other types of regenerative forms of life. So yes, these are my overarching comments, and I look forward to diving in the question and panel discussion and more into some of these statements with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Super interesting. Yeah, let's delve deeper in now in the discussion part. I would therefore also like to invite Markus Fischer. He is one of the authors of the report. He is an ecologist and biodiversity researcher. Today, he joins us from Switzerland, where he is, among many other things, the managing director of the Department of Biology at the University of Bern. He is also a member of the World Biodiversity Council, IPBES. And now, Markus, I would like to know from you, I mean, you have listened now as being one of the authors. What do you comment on the comments?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot, Mrs. Glenn-Pili and Mr. Kaiser, for your insightful comments. I think it's too bad. I agree with everything that has been said. So it would be easier to disagree with something to make for a lively discussion, but I will still try. First, I think Mrs. Glenn-Pili made a very important point when she said decarbonization is still, regardless of how we treat land, is still absolutely mandatory. And I think the advisory council would subscribe to that very much. We have to go away from fossils. That is absolutely mandatory. And we still need a better stewardship of land as an additional contribution to climate change mitigation. But land alone cannot solve the problem, and we definitely have to defossilize and decarbonize. So I would fully agree with that. I also very much liked her emphasis of the strategic planning at the landscape scale. We have been advocating this integrated landscape approach. And I think she exactly put it right, that the landscape scale is the right scale. It's neither too small nor too big. So it's the right scale where you can negotiate the different demands. And she also made a very important point. From there, you can upscale. And that is, of course, extremely important. I also fully subscribe to the emphasis by both of the commenters on restoration being about creating opportunities for people. Of course, we would emphasize the opportunities in the dimensions of the trilemma. So for all the dimensions of the trilemma, so for climate change, mitigation, adaptation, for food security, for biodiversity, plus the business opportunities that have been mentioned. In the context of agents of change, I also fully agree that it's also about supporting them, about leadership on the ground, as pointed out by Mr. Kaiser, and finally also about creating careers. And I would think that creating careers with restoration is probably challenging on the one hand, but because, and I very much like the comment by Mr. Kaiser about this mind shift from doom and gloom, from a passive suffering from changes to an active restoring role, healing role, creating opportunities role. And I think that automatically leads to creating opportunities, also business opportunities. But of course, we have to get the governance right, the frame conditions. So the tax system, the budgeting system, and also the trade regulations, which we point out in our report. I also fully agree that indigenous peoples and local communities are very, very important for restoration efforts, for conservation, and also because they are very important knowledge holders. So they're important, very, very important agents of change. And I want to conclude with fully agreeing that a shift of mindset is actually very much needed. So a different perspective, different set of values that we need. And I agree that the young generation can contribute a lot here, but I wouldn't limit it to the young generation, of course. And I would think that all of us as a society, we should move from externalizing our effects on nature, on biodiversity, and therefore then the related effects on climate and on food security. We should move from externalizing these effects to internalizing them, not only into the tax system and so forth, but also into our own mindsets.
Great. Thank you so much, Markus. And maybe this is already a good point where we can bring in the question that we have in the audience. So I would like to ask my co-moderator, Jan, to join us and to present us the question that is already there, if there is a question.
Yes, Rebecca, thank you. I leave my camera switched off because it's just about the question. So there's, I would say, we can group the questions so far into two blocks. The first is regarding the power of the multi-benefit strategies and on economic systems to implement them. So it's two related questions. First, do we also need to reduce economic growth and eventually get to a steady state in order to halt consumption growth and the related destructions? And secondly, and related, so far, mainstream approach is the formation of financial capital through the use and abuse of natural and social capital. Are the 5 strategies of the WBGU open for diversified economic approaches? So that's the first block. Are the multiple benefit strategies strong enough to, or enough to stop or to accommodate economic growth, or do we have to halt it, and how do we implement it? And then the second would be, how can multinational corporations and also universities, schools and educators act towards these 5 strategies, support local activities and promote the shift of mindset? So what can actually be done to promote the mindset shift? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jan. So the big question about economy was raised. Markus, you already mentioned internalizing externalities here. I would like to pass this question now to Tina and get your view on this, if you like to comment on it.
Yeah, very simply, I think I made that point also in my opening remarks. It's very true that unless we have a true accountability framework where all the externalities are being internalized, we will continue to consume in the way we do. So basically, we will continue having this linear economy, and we will not be able to give back this circle. Every action has to go back from where we started. However, I would like to say something, and I will be very, very firm on it. The decade of ecosystem restoration is also a decade of hope, because it's something positive. You will restore, you will reimagine, you will recreate, you will find yourself into this restoration movement. And as Florence said, it's very important in the end of the decade not to measure the trees, but to measure also the how the livelihoods have benefited from that decade, how many jobs have been created. And this is completely the opposite of reducing economic growth. It's creating economic growth, but in a different way. And coming from, and since Rebecca, you mentioned that in the beginning, coming from a convention that has been very successful and possibly the only multilateral environmental convention that has been so successful, the Montreal Protocol, the main message there is the following. You don't say to people, stop, do that. You tell them you can do it in a different way, and we will support you in the different way that you're going to do it. So I would definitely think that there are ways. You don't need to reduce your economic growth. On the contrary, green economy is for increasing the economic growth of a country. And I would definitely see the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration as something very positive, very optimistic, and very ambitious. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And maybe, Florent, you can also add from your experience as being a so-called ecopreneur. I mean, you really try to use business techniques and business methods in order to do restoration. So how do you see this question about economic growth versus restoration?
So I think, Tina, you explained it in a very symbolic and practical way at the same time, and you were spot on. Let's say to put it even more as a symbol of the growth opportunities that I see, think of a very arid, desertic, heavily degraded area. And we know there's some areas that have, it's not necessarily degradation that caused the desertification and so on, but think of a arid land. Think then by introducing a new mindset, new technology, like solar powered modules, creating local energy that is able to desaline water, that is able to bring in water again into this, and then starting to grow crops on lands over time that were not able to grow lands. And then if you start smallly with micro businesses that can harness this sort of agriculture, you get a little bit of the spirit of this by recreating, by restoring some natural capital. Multiple opportunities arise from that. And this is applicable in many, many different ways. And it is not only the tree planters that are important in that, or the food growers. It's, again, investors behind the renewable energies, investors into land, investors into real estate at some point. So it becomes, once you create approaches where you have that mindset shift that is, again, about creating opportunities in a specific areas by, as a fundamental question, restoring natural capital at the base of it, it becomes a very attractive thing for investors and private sector investment. And right now, as an ecopreneur, I couldn't highlight more the fact that so many young people, so many businesses, it's not all about young people only, but businesses, young business, at really taking into that challenge and creating technologies, creating new forms of businesses that actually are in line with that. And these are the ones that are at the moment really, really attractive and driving this conversation of renewal forward quite a bit. Now, just to have, for the sake of having mentioned, of course, every time I go to bed, we keep thinking about there are certain sectors and there are certain behemoth organizations and industries that need a fundamental framework to be probably forced to change, because there are certain things that we know need to change and can be changed via a regulatory framework. And this is within the framework of hope and positive outlook. This also means that some of the things that belong maybe to the past need to be stopped as fast as possible, including fossil fuel extractions in all the different variants.
Thank you, Florent. One of our co-chair, Karen Pittel, she also would like to join our discussion for a statement.
Yeah, just a very short one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm positively thrilled with the answers we just heard, because I think they make very clear that our main concern should be about getting the framework conditions right, about getting externalities internalized, about providing the right incentives, and then basically whether we grow or not will be a result of activities, of the economic activities within these boundaries. But we cannot say that we will foster growth in favor for everything. We need to get those conditions right. And then there's no right or wrong answer to have growth or not have growth, like we just heard. That's a very different answers for very different regions, but also for very different sectors, for example. So I think the question, do we need to stop growth, is just simplifying things way too much.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, talking about the right conditions, I would actually like to ask Tina, you've just mentioned that you have worked for the most successful convention, the Montreal Protocol. So I'm wondering, could a global land summit be successful as well? Do you see, could you make it a success? And can you maybe also tell a little bit about how to align the efforts of other UN agreements that we already have, especially also with you in that position at the UNCCD, how to collaborate with other Rio conventions, such as combating climate change or biodiversity. So yeah, this question's to you. What is the right condition from an international policy view?
So, Rebecca, I think these are two questions that I would like to address a bit separately. The Land Summit, I read it very carefully, and it's about bringing the three conference of the parties together in a joint meeting. First of all, I want to mention that the United Nations is a very powerful mechanism because it simply has a convening power, and it offers the space where the different parties come together with incredible different expectations. They negotiate, and you have a way forward. Sometimes you don't even have a way forward, but most of the times you have a way forward till consensus is reached. So the United Nations is just has a convening power. It's a broker where people and countries come together. And this is why we are called secretariats, because we are the secretary of the parties. We are the secretary of the governments. We don't decide on our own. So this has to be very clearly said, that if the countries and the governments decide to come together, bringing all these three COPs together, this is exclusively their own decision. Having said that, I don't want to avoid the point of your question by possibly sounding as being bureaucratic. I think that the challenge is not a top-down challenge. I think that the challenge of land stewardship is more evident at the national level. Bringing the governance apparatus together internationally, I don't think that it will solve necessarily the synergies on the ground, which are very, very important. We at the UNCCD, we are a relatively small secretariat, and we do exemplify great care in ensuring that when we put together certain projects, certain programs, certain initiatives about the countries that have requested our assistance, we do take into consideration biodiversity issues, land issues, of course, and climate change issues. But this is not enough. And there needs to be a better coordination and cooperation between the three Rio conventions. And this is why I think that reports as the one that we have now, which basically are being conveyed to the governments and give to the governments very specific, a specific direction, they recommend a direction. It's also very important because this government direction will come back and will reflect back when the conference of the parties meet at the international level. So to sum up, I think a land summit may not be a recommendation that will solve the problem. More things need to be done at the national level. The governments need to think in a more integrated way, and this integration will be reflected at the global level through the different mechanisms that exist. I would stop here, I think, and we can have a conversation on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. I would like to bring this topic now to you, Florent, because you have experience at the UN level. You have been part of the Global Landscape Forum. Now you work at the grassroots level. So do you see the effects of those international agreements? Is it really effective on the ground? And what is it that we may haven't understood yet? What do you have any message or advice back to the international level?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Tina, for your prior comment. I think it's somewhat implicit in your question. The international level and the grassroots level, as I mentioned before, there's still a severe disconnect between the two, and that has to do with many, many different factors. One of them being that a lot of the international level is simply unable today to understand local community needs and wishes further than quite often a quite rational, descriptive, scientific approach, right? Which is quite often not necessarily exactly fitting to the more day-to-day human-based conversation that is happening on the ground, and rational decisions by local families and so on. And yes, what I wanted to say there, that what I increasingly got a little bit adverse of when attending forums, we highlight the needs of indigenous communities and so on, but it almost gets commodified down. The indigenous people, we need to respect them and so on. However, when you are within those local communities, you understand that at a very different level, culture, identity at the ground level are profoundly impacting how they treat their land, how they would like to move forward. And simply the incapacity to recognize these, reconcile these two facts is in their effects. Now, the second thing I want to mention is, what we need to do now, I think, is, as I said before, really move into a shift from this, accompanying the global frameworks, yes, and so on, but shift a lot towards its implementation and help countries actually really get resources down on the ground to support the local actors. We always talk about these global mechanisms that provide funding to governments and to the local levels. Well, the local level mentioned internationally in all these conventions couldn't be further away from the local levels that local communities are considering the local levels. There's a huge, within a country, there's a huge gap between receiving funding and being part of the international mechanism and actually doing the work on the ground. So there's, and our firm, a lot of what we do is actually helping to make that connection possible. How can, for example, the Green Climate Fund invest actually into on-the-ground-led efforts, and not only through subnational or national entities that ultimately, in a lot of cases, fail or heavily delay investments that actually reach where local communities where it's actually needed. And the third thing I want to mention is to bring it back again to a positive outlook. The power of inspiration. And so with, think countries and partnership, multi-countries partnership that are based on actual results, programs that are based on actual results, whether it's tree planting, wetland restoration, ecosystem and coastal ecosystem restoration, but it's sort of massive undertaking led by local communities and governments together that deliver clear results. To me, it provides an inspiration that goes beyond borders, and that actually helps influence the global conversation. And then to respond to one of the questions that was put in the audience, how do international corporations, private sector corporations fit into that? Well, I think they have a very clear role. They are less cumbersome, let's say, to actually do investments and financial contributions. So in our example, for example, we are using at the moment and helping global corporates invest directly into local grassroots ecosystem restoration efforts. And by that, providing an inspiring case of success and of progress, and that they themselves, the corporations, become actually drivers of this conversation, not only through their consumers, but also globally in these global forums, and then become themselves an agent of change. And we're seeing this with a lot of different corporations that are thinking proactively and positively about that. This, just to mention the last point, is very different to corporations that are backwards looking and trying to protect an established business model that we know need to transition. But the proactiveness, the proactive leadership on it, and the sort of the inspiring results of collaboration that actually deliver results on the ground at the grassroots community level is something very powerful that we are using at this point to really bring this global conversation forward.
Great. Thank you, Florent, for these many points that you touched upon. I would like now to ask Jan again to give us an update if there are new questions coming from the audience.
Yes, thank you. So I tried to distill 2 more questions from the Q&A section, also from the chat section. One is, both relate to the interaction between the international and landscape level, I'd say. So one question is, the need to establish new alliances at 3 different levels has been mentioned. Haven't a large number of such alliances been established in recent years? And what should distinguish the proposed new alliances from existing ones? That's one question. And relatedly, which role can integrated land use planning play in a system where the produced goods or mined raw materials are used and marketed by for example, large international corporations?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I would like to pass. I would like to pass this question on to you, Markus. Would you like to answer?
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely true that there is many international conventions, multilateral organizations, and so forth. So the question why there should be new ones is a good one. I would think that new alliances who share values along this integrated landscape approach, along the triple S of systemic, synergistic, and solidarity-driven approaches, can actually be novel if they really address these multiple benefit strategies, or if they explicitly try to promote these multiple benefit strategies. And now, of course, we were distinguishing between different cases. In the case of neighboring countries which are sharing particular ecosystems, they might have a lot to offer to each other in terms of know-how, in terms of management, in terms of synergy in these respects. If you have a decentralized group, then it's probably more about sharing values, again, about sharing know-how, and there might also be mutual benefits between these different strategies. And then finally, we have some big areas of global commons. Think of huge rainforests or huge wetlands or huge marine areas, which are absolutely central to the climate system, for biodiversity, and also for many livelihoods. And if the options are to see them go, or as as countries to try to promote their diversity or their maintenance, their stewardship, then I think the second option is definitely much better. Of course, that has to happen without patronizing, without neo-colonialistic ideas. It is about global commons, about stewardship for global commons. And we are currently lacking that, or we're not seeing the success. So I think there is definitely space for new alliances trying that.
Talking about new alliances, Tina, what do you think? Wouldn't be that a way forward? Alliances with like-minded states?
Absolutely. I mean, always the way forward is through alliances, and all the negotiations in the United Nations are being done through like-minded countries. I mean, it's something that it goes without saying that you definitely need to create this critical mass of people, of governments that think alike, that think the same, that share the same principles and the same values, as Marcus has said. This is different from creating new structures, new conventions, but it's how you ensure that you give life to the existing structures that you have. I don't know if I have one more minute to add something to the previous discussion, which was very interesting. And I think it was again mentioned by Florent, something that I would like to add my voice. What I see as a very big challenge for the international conventions is that when governments come up with new frameworks, separate frameworks for separate conventions. So we have the national determined contributions for the climate change convention. We have the land degradation neutrality for the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. We will have a new framework for the biodiversity convention, hopefully later this year. For me, this is the big challenge. How you assist governments at the national and subnational and local level to create programs and projects that change people's lives by bringing together elements from all these three different frameworks. And this means that the funds that we have, that the development banks that we have, they need to tick the box of biodiversity, climate change, and land when they approve or when they follow the implementation of a project. And for me, this is a big gap that the international community has not addressed, how to assist countries, to assist municipalities, to assist governments in developing these holistic projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina. Yeah, assisting people on the ground. Yeah, I was looking at you as well, Florent. You already mentioned in your comment change agent, and we heard from our co-chairs that we need corresponding frameworks that enable change agent to, act fully. Do you have any ideas or suggestions how those frameworks could look like, Florent?
I think one of the things that we tend to look at frameworks as a robust, fixed, almost glass box put onto us, and that has a fixed set of rules, and we need to basically push the world to fit within that framework. Now that has certainly a lot of truth in it, because there are some things that are just, that we just need to get done. However, the one reflection accompanying all the COPs and events that over the last 2 decades, let's see it also as a planetary conversation, not just a fixed framework that we need to follow, but a conversation that is very much evolving year by year when global leaders are meeting, and when science and new reports come out, and when new innovations are coming out, and when new technology are coming out. We need to accept that these conventions, on one hand, need to be robust and very concrete in their outcomes. However, also need to be embracing on our own journey as a human species, let's say, to incorporate that transition towards regeneration and toward positive development. And I think one of the things that is very challenging for conventions and multilateral organizations is to actually embrace innovation and pace. So every time the criteria for projects and so on are being defined, they're defined down to the very least level, and quite often that makes it unapplicable for new approaches and new types of collaborations. So my invitation there as an entrepreneur would be to, yes, we need to have the right strategies to enable change, but change and leadership for change comes inevitably with embracing quite a lot of time the unknown and daring to implement things differently that were proven to be working before. And without, I'm very, I say this in between two big marks, because I certainly don't want to say follow the sort of the US approach to highlighting the big techs there and the Elon Musk and so on, the big ecopreneurs transforming the planet. But there is something to it, right? There is something with, at the same time, seeing the trajectories that we are on and providing clear pathway, clear solutions, and at the same time bringing them into markets that they actually be able to consume and build and invest upon into this. So that the leadership aspect to me has to be a conversation. It's not just at one time saying, stop, we need to do things differently. It's a conversation and a constant resetting of collaborations, of partnerships, of trying new things out, of implementing projects, of inspiring with results and innovating from that and changing. And this very clearly marks the journey of an entrepreneur. If we're set on an idea, we fail tomorrow.
Thank you, Florent, for these strong words. We're about to approach the end of the journey of this presentation today. So here comes my last question to all of you, and I would like you to answer it in like 1 or 2 sentences. What do you think, what can each of us, each of the audience, each of us listeners do in the spirit of the report? What is your last message to the audience? And here, is there anyone who would like to start? Markus.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I could make a start. I mean, obviously, we can all do a lot. We can eat differently. That's something we do every day. Many of us too often. So we can eat differently. We can consume differently. And in whatever we are having as roles, as parents or as professionals, we can decide differently. The more in the direction of a more sustainable behavior. We can all vote, and we can, that is of course very important, and we are all multipliers of some messages, and if the messages of this report would be amongst the messages that we are multiplying, we can also have a good role.
Thank you, Markus. Who would like to go next? Tina?
I simply would like to agree with whatever Markus has said, and just to underline what Florence said about the mindset. This is something that we definitely need to change in our daily lives, even if we are managers, parents, farmers, consumers. I think this mindset is something, so education and mindset are very, very important ways forward. And 2 more things, that I always believe in the power of science. I do think that these scientific assessments that combine case studies, combined solutions that relate to the environment, but also open the horizons on possible governance changes are very, very, very important. And finally, in all the UN meetings, I think the most important part is to inject optimism and to ensure that things can happen in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you for your positive words, Tina. Florent, what are your last words?
I think they're very much aligned with what Tina said last, the positive change. I think I've made it multiple times clear. We need to learn how to really listen and sometimes think quite a lot outside of our current career and sort of pathway and so on, and listen not only in our own communities, but also globally as a very, very complex global community with all different types of level. But at the same time, I, as well, like Tina, fundamentally believe in that positive outlook, that innovation and leadership needs to be based on basically the demonstration that there is an alternative path, and that alternative path is worth exploring, investing in, and worth living for each of us. And so without saying that when one particular technology is better than another one, or one approach is better than the other one, inviting ourselves our children, our parents, and our governments and on to really go outside of our box and think globally as a planetary species, what needs to be done, and start doing it and investing in it. I think I'm a strong optimist, and I would like to share that spirit with you, that we can really do it, but let's give our best, because there's not much else we should be doing at this point.
Thank you. And I would like to pass this positive spirit on to you, all of those who have listened here today. If you need some more food for thought, feel free to visit the WBGU website, where you can order the report free of charge, either as a book or as a download. And you can also watch the 17 minutes video in English. And now, thank you, dear experts, so much for taking the time for your work, what you're doing. And also thank you, dear authors, dear co-chairs. And now I hand over to Karen Pittel for the final words.
Yeah, I don't think I have that much to add, but I also want to ask to thank our audience for being interested in our reports, for taking part in the webinar, for asking really good questions. And of course, I also like to ask our participants of this plenary session for the really thought-inspiring remarks you made, and also for me, it made very clear that we have to think really on all levels, and we tend to think about environmental problems often on a global scale, on national scales, but we kind of forget to integrate the individuals in our planning, in our flexibility on how to approach things. And I think this was very, very obvious that we need to do better on that side, on that scale. And so thank you very much for giving me a lot of things to think about. And the only thing that remains for me now is to all wish you a pleasant rest of the day and a good read in our report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.